II, as triumphant shouts of victory echoed through the streets of Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard his flagship, the mighty battleship Yamato, contemplating not celebration but catastrophe. While Japan's military machine was crushing everything in its path across the Pacific, Yamamoto understood a truth that few others grasped. Japan was winning itself into a corner from which there might be no escape. The speed of Japan's conquest was breathtaking. In just 1 month, Japanese forces had crippled the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, sunk the British battleships HMS Repulse and Prince of Wales, captured Manila, Hong Kong, and were driving deep into Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. The Western powers appeared helpless before this unstoppable tide. Yet Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was deeply troubled. He instructed his chief of staff, Mato Magaki, to begin planning the second phase of Pacific operations, with completion required by mid-February. But this wasn't the confidence of a conquering admiral, it was the urgency of a man racing against time itself. Yamamoto was perhaps the only Japanese admiral who truly understood America. From 1926 to 1928, he had served as naval attaché in Washington, walking American streets, studying American industry, observing American determination. He had attended the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934, negotiating face-to-face with Western powers. While other Japanese officers saw America as soft and decadent, Yamamoto had seen the factories of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas, the limitless productive capacity of a continental nation. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, he had met with an old friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultranationalist Kakusui-do organization. His warning was prophetic. At first, we'll have everything our own way, stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles. The metaphor was apt. And now, just 1 month into the war, the octopus was indeed spread almost flat across the Pacific. But Yamamoto had continued with darker prophecy. We'll run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, I have utterly no confidence. He believed Japan had perhaps 18 months to achieve victory and negotiate peace. After that, America's industrial might would grind Japan into dust. This wasn't defeatism, it was mathematics. Yamamoto knew that America produced 17 times more oil than Japan, 5 times more steel, 7 times more coal. Every month the war continued tilted the scales further against Japan. Yamamoto's realism made him dangerous in Tokyo. The reason he commanded from sea aboard the Yamato wasn't purely tactical. Friends in the Imperial General Staff had warned that ultranationalists might assassinate him for his public opposition to unlimited war with America and Britain. He had opposed the war from the beginning, but once politicians made the decision, his duty was clear: win quickly, decisively, and create conditions for negotiated peace. His chief of staff, Admiral Igaki, captured this tension in his diary, writing about the need for far-sighted statesmanship following this first month of glorious victories. These were Yamamoto's words, a coded criticism of Prince Kono and other politicians who seemed not to know what kind of war Japan should wage in the Pacific. The strategic debate within Japanese high command revealed fundamental divisions. The ardent militarists wanted to press forward relentlessly while momentum lasted, regardless of overextension. They saw victory breeding more victory, and believed Japanese spirit could overcome any material disadvantage. The army faction focused on continental objectives: China, Soviet Siberia, possibly India. They viewed naval adventures in the Pacific as distractions from Japan's manifest destiny on the Asian mainland. Yamamoto's strategic vision differed from both. He proposed 3 possible second-phase operations. Option 1. The Soviet Gambit attacked the Soviet Union from the east while Germany pressed from the west. This would secure Siberia's resources and eliminate a potential threat. But the army vetoed this immediately. They were already overstretched in China and Southeast Asia, and memories of defeat at Kochanjiol in 1939 made them wary of failed to destroy American aircraft carriers, which had been at sea that fateful morning. These carriers represented a constant threat, and more importantly, they were the heart of American naval power in the Pacific. Midway, a tiny atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, was America's westernmost significant outpost. An invasion there would force the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle. Yamamoto could deploy overwhelming force, carriers, battleships, the entire might of the combined fleet, and destroy American naval power in one stroke. With the U.S. fleet eliminated, Japan could negotiate from a position of unassailable strength. Perhaps even invade Hawaii, making American reconquest impossible. At minimum, the devastating defeat would force America to accept a negotiated peace that left Japan master of the Western Pacific. The AL plan, targeting Alaska's Aleutian Islands, would proceed simultaneously, extending the defensive perimeter and potentially opening a route to the North American mainland. These weren't fantasies. Yamamoto's staff conducted detailed operational planning. Victory at Midway would fundamentally alter the strategic balance. It would give politicians the leverage Yamamoto believed necessary for the peace negotiations he desperately sought. There was just one problem. It all depended on surprise and the Americans doing exactly what Yamamoto expected. And in war, the enemy gets a vote. In early April 1942, Yamamoto's careful strategic planning was about to collide with an American audacity that would change the entire course of the Pacific War. The American dilemma. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, America was reeling. The Philippines were falling, Wake Island had surrendered, Guam was lost. General Douglas MacArthur had fled to Australia, promising "I shall return," but leaving thousands of American and Filipino soldiers to face death or brutal captivity. The Bataan Death March would soon shock the American public. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, had fallen in February in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. American morale was at rock bottom. The Pacific Fleet was crippled, the Army was unprepared, and production was only beginning to ramp up. President Roosevelt needed something, anything, to show the American people that they could strike back. He needed to prove that Japan wasn't invincible, that American fighting spirit wasn't broken. The problem seemed impossible. How do you attack the Japanese home islands when they're 2,000 miles from the nearest American base? Carrier planes lacked the range. Long-range bombers couldn't reach from any friendly airfield. Enter Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle. At 45, Jimmy Doolittle was already a legend in American aviation. He had won the first Schneider Trophy race, performed the first outside loop, been the first to fly blind using instruments alone. He held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He was a test pilot, a racing champion, and a man who understood both the science and the art of flying better than almost anyone alive. In January 1942, Navy Captain Francis Lowe was visiting Naval Air Station Norfolk when he watched some Army bombers practicing takeoffs and landings. A wild idea struck him. What if Army bombers could take off from Navy aircraft carriers? It seemed insane. Army bombers were heavy, designed for long runways. Carrier decks were short, designed for lightweight naval aircraft. But Lowe brought the idea to Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, who saw its potential immediately. King sent for Doolittle. The impossible mission. Doolittle's task was straightforward in concept, hellishly complex in execution. Modify Army B-25 Mitchell bombers to take off from a carrier deck, fly 650 miles to Japan, bomb Tokyo and other cities, then continue another 1,200 miles to land in China. No B-25 had ever taken off from a carrier. The bombers had never been designed for such short takeoffs. And landing on a carrier was impossible. The B-25 was far too heavy. This would be a one-way mission, dependent on Chinese allies having fuel ready at landing strips deep in their territory. Doolittle handpicked 80 volunteers from the 17th Bombardment Group, telling them only that it would be dangerous, important, and interesting. He didn't tell them the target. He didn't tell them they'd be taking off from a carrier. He simply asked, "Who wants to go?" Every man volunteered. The modifications. Doolittle's team stripped the bombers of everything non-essential. They removed the lower gun turret to save weight. They installed additional fuel tanks in every available space, even in the crawlways. They reduced the bomb load to increase fuel capacity. Each plane would carry 3 500-pound high-explosive bombs and one 500-pound incendiary cluster. The crews trained relentlessly at Eglin Field in Florida, practicing short takeoffs until they could get a fully loaded B-25 airborne in 450 feet, still far more than a carrier deck, but the best they could do. They practiced low-level navigation over water. They studied maps and photographs of Tokyo until they could navigate the city blindfolded. The Hornet and Task Force 18. On April 2, 16 B-25s were loaded aboard USS Hornet in San Francisco. The sight was surreal. Army bombers lashed to the deck of a Navy carrier. Captain Mark Mitcher, the Hornet's commanding officer, addressed his crew. "This ship will carry the Army bombers to the coast of Japan for the bombing of Tokyo." The crew erupted in cheers that echoed across the harbor. Task Force 18 sailed on April 2. Hornet and Enterprise, providing fighter cover, 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers and 2 oilers. Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey commanded from Enterprise. The plan was to approach within 450 miles of Japan on April 18, launch in darkness, bomb at dawn and reach China by nightfall. Discovery and the early launch. At 7:38 a.m. on April 18, 650 miles from Japan, the task force encountered a Japanese picket boat, the Nito Maru. The cruiser USS Nashville opened fire immediately, sinking the vessel. But had it radioed a warning? Halsey and Doolittle faced an agonizing decision. They were 200 miles further from Japan than planned. The extra distance meant the bombers might not reach China. Some might run out of fuel over the ocean or crash land in Japanese-occupied territory. But if the picket boat had warned Tokyo, the task force was in mortal danger. Every hour they delayed increased the risk of Japanese attack. At 8 a.m. Halsey signaled Doolittle, "Launch planes." To Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command, "Good luck and God bless you." The launch. The deck of Hornet pitched and rolled in heavy seas. Each B-25 needed every foot of the 467-foot deck. If a bomber faltered on takeoff, it would plunge into the ocean and the bombers behind it couldn't take off. The entire mission would fail. Lieutenant Henry Miller, who had never served aboard a ship before that day, would lead the first takeoff. Navy Lieutenant Henry Miller, no relation, stood at the bow, signaling when the deck was at the optimal angle as the ship rose and fell. At 8:20 a.m., Miller released his brakes and pushed the throttles forward. The B-25 thundered down the deck, spray whipping across the wings. It lifted off with just feet to spare, dropped briefly toward the waves, then clawed for altitude. One by one, all 16 bombers took off safely, a testament to the skill of the pilots and the excellence of their training. The last plane, piloted by Lieutenant Bill Farrow, had just 467 feet of deck. He made it, though his plane practically brushed the bow as it lifted off. The carriers immediately turned and fled at maximum speed. They had accomplished the impossible. Now it was up to Doolittle and his men. Over Japan. Flying at wave-top height to avoid detection, the 16 bombers separated into groups targeting Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. They climbed to 1,500 feet only as they approached their targets. Doolittle's bomber arrived over Tokyo at 12:30 p.m. local time. Air raid sirens wailed, but many Japanese thought it was just another drill. Japanese fighters scrambled, but the B-25s were already over the city. The bombs fell. Doolittle's plane hit an aircraft factory, an oil storage facility, and a steel mill. Other bombers struck the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal oil refineries, factories, and the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries plant. The incendiary clusters started fires across residential neighborhoods. The physical damage was minimal, fewer than 100 casualties, 50 dead. But the psychological impact was seismic. The sacred homeland had been violated. The emperor had been placed at risk. The military's promise to keep Japan safe was shattered. The aftermath. No bomber reached its intended landing strip in China. Warning messages hadn't gotten through. Landing lights weren't lit. As darkness fell and fuel gauges dropped toward empty, the crews faced impossible choices. 15 crews bailed out or crash-landed in China or off the coast. One landed in the Soviet Union, where the crew was interned. The Soviets weren't at war with Japan and couldn't openly assist Americans. Of the 80 raiders, 3 died in crashes or bailouts. 8 were captured by Japanese forces in China. 3 of those were executed, a 4th died in captivity. The other 4 survived as POWs. 69 men eventually returned to American lines, aided by Chinese villagers and nationalist forces. In retaliation, Japan launched the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, killing an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians in areas that had helped the raiders. The strategic earthquake. Yamamoto was aboard Yamato when the news arrived. The report was stunning. American bombers had struck Tokyo in broad daylight. The unthinkable had happened. The raid crystallized every fear Yamamoto had harbored. If American bombers could reach Tokyo now, just 4 months into the war, what would they be capable of in a year? 2 years? The homeland was vulnerable. The emperor was at risk. The whole strategic premise of a defensive perimeter was undermined if American carriers could penetrate it at will. The Imperial General Staff convened emergency sessions. The Army and Navy pointed fingers at each other. How had American carriers gotten so close? Where was the picket line? Why weren't they detected? The political implications were enormous. The government had assured the Japanese people they were safe. That assurance was now exposed as hollow. Yamamoto saw his strategic opening. He could now argue forcefully for the Midway operation. The only way to protect the homeland, he insisted, was to extend the defensive perimeter eastward and destroy the American carriers that threatened Japan. The General Staff, chastened by the Doolittle raid, couldn't effectively argue against him. The debate that had raged for months was settled in days. The MI plan, the attack on Midway, was approved. The operation would proceed in early June. Historians debate what would have happened without the Doolittle raid. Might Japan have pursued the Indian Ocean strategy, potentially changing the entire war? Might they have focused on consolidating their southern conquests rather than overextending eastward? What's certain is this: the Doolittle raid gave Yamamoto the political capital to pursue the decisive battle he believed necessary. It triggered a chain of events that would culminate in Japan's first major defeat, and the beginning of the end of Japanese offensive operations in the Pacific. For America, the raid's impact on morale was incalculable. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Tokyo bombed." Americans celebrated in the streets. President Roosevelt, when asked where the bombers had come from, smiled and said, "Shangri-La, a fictional paradise from a popular novel." Jimmy Doolittle, who had considered the mission a failure because all 16 bombers were lost, received the Medal of Honor. He had expected a court-martial for losing his aircraft. Instead, he became an American hero and was promoted to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. The raid proved America could strike back. It showed that courage and ingenuity could overcome material disadvantage. It demonstrated that Japan wasn't invincible. F was short of fresh water. F was Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, gambled everything on Rockefeller's intelligence. He positioned Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush. The battle. June 4th dawned clear. At 4:30 a.m., Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuchi, the same admiral who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, launched his first strike against Midway from 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The American defenders on Midway fought desperately but were overwhelmed. Nagumo prepared to launch a second wave. But at 7:28 a.m., a Japanese scout plane reported 10 ships, apparently enemy, sighted. Carriers? Nagumo needed to know. If American carriers were nearby, he should launch an immediate strike. But his planes were being rearmed with bombs for the second Midway attack. Should he launch half-ready, or wait to rearm with torpedoes for anti-ship strikes? Nagumo waited. It was a fatal decision. At 7:55 a.m., the scout plane confirmed, enemy accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo ordered immediate rearming with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. His hangar decks became scenes of organized chaos, planes being rearmed, fuel lines snaking everywhere, ordnance stacked on decks because there was no time to return it to magazines. The American strikes came in waves. First, torpedo bombers from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown attacked without fighter escort. Flying slow and low, they were slaughtered by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Of 41 Devastator torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo hit. But the sacrifice wasn't in vain. The low-level attacks pulled Japanese fighters down to wave-top height. At 10:22 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived at 14,000 feet. The sky was clear above them. The Japanese carriers were turning in the water, vulnerable and exposed. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, saw 4 carriers below, their decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft. He picked the nearest carrier, Kaga, and pushed over into his dive. What happened in the next 6 minutes decided the Pacific War. Dive bombers screamed down at nearly 300 miles per hour. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but at that angle and speed, the bombers were nearly impossible to hit. 10:24 a.m. The first bomb hit Kaga amidships, detonating in the hangar. Fully fueled planes exploded. Ordnance cooked off. A second bomb hit near the bridge. A third hit forward. In seconds, Kaga was a floating inferno. 10:26 a.m. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, took a bomb that penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar among rearming aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction. Torpedoes detonated. Aviation fuel ignited. Within minutes, fire was out of control. 10:26 a.m. Soryu took 3 direct hits in rapid succession. Like her sisters, her decks were crowded with armed aircraft. She erupted in flames. In 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks. On Hiryu, the sole survivor, Admiral Yamaguchi launched an immediate counterstrike that would cripple Yorktown. But that afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu and destroyed her too. By evening, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sinking or abandoned. Japan lost 248 aircraft and, critically, many of her most experienced pilots and aircrew. The Americans lost Yorktown and 147 aircraft. The strategic consequences. Yamamoto couldn't believe the reports. His intelligence had said the Americans had at most 2 carriers in the Pacific. How had 3 appeared at exactly the right place and time? He didn't know about the codebreakers. He didn't know the Americans had been reading Japanese mail for weeks. He didn't know that what he had planned as a surprise attack had instead become an ambush. More fundamentally, Midway exposed the flaw in Yamamoto's entire strategy. He had gambled on a quick, decisive victory that would force America to negotiate. But America didn't want to negotiate. America wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor, and it had the industrial capacity to sustain a long war. The Japanese High Command made a decision that would have profound consequences. They would hide the extent of the defeat. The army wasn't told the full truth. Injured survivors were quarantined on remote islands or bases to prevent stories from leaking. The news to the Japanese public reported Midway as a minor setback, perhaps even a victory. Even within the Navy, only the highest levels knew that 4 fleet carriers, the same 4 that had struck Pearl Harbor, were gone forever. Junior officers and enlisted men were told the ships were being repaired. This deception meant that strategic planning continued as if Japan still had naval superiority. The plans to cut off Australia, to extend the defensive perimeter, to consolidate the southern conquests. All proceeded as if Midway hadn't fundamentally altered the balance of power. It was into this context of denial and deception that the Guadalcanal operation would unfold. While Yamamoto had been pursuing his Midway strategy, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had been steadily moving forces southward. The goal remained severing the supply line between America and Australia, the Japanese Southern Drive. In January, naval forces had taken Rabaul on New Britain, establishing what would become Japan's most important forward base in the South Pacific. From Rabaul, they conducted constant air reconnaissance and bombing raids against New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. In March, they invaded Salamaua and Lae in New Guinea. In May, they attempted to take Port Moresby, the key to controlling Papua, but were turned back by American and Australian forces in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft without the surface ships ever sighting each other. Though tactically inconclusive, both sides lost a fleet carrier. Coral Sea was strategically significant. Japan had been stopped. For the first time, an amphibious invasion had been turned back. But the Japanese weren't deterred. They occupied Tulagi in the southern Solomons and built a seaplane base. And on Guadalcanal, a large island 20 miles south of Tulagi, they began constructing an airfield. The American Intelligence Network. What made the Japanese airfield at Guadalcanal so significant wasn't its size or location, it was what it represented. From Guadalcanal, Japanese aircraft could dominate the sea lanes to Australia. They could support further advances to New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. They could cut the supply line that kept Australia in the war. But the Japanese didn't know that the Allies had eyes watching them. Throughout the Solomon Islands, a network of Australian coast watchers, planters, colonial officials, and volunteers remained behind Japanese lines, hiding in the jungle and radioing intelligence. On June 25, Army intelligence reported that grass on Guadalcanal's central plain had been burned off. Tents were going up. A wharf was under construction. On July 1st, Coast Watcher Martin Clemens reported that Japanese construction units, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, would arrive on July 4th to begin building the airfield. Admiral Nimitz's radio intelligence group confirmed the report by intercepting Japanese messages. The pieces came together. Japan was building an airfield that would dominate the South Pacific. The command debate. The question was what to do about it. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific from Australia, wanted to drive straight at Rabaul, the source of Japanese air and naval power. Give him 2 carriers and 1,000 planes, he argued, and he'd force the Japanese back to truck. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, opposed putting carriers under MacArthur's command. King had a different vision, a drive up the Solomons chain by forces under Navy command, then converging on Rabaul from multiple directions. The Joint Chiefs of Staff split the difference. Phase 1, taking Tulagi, Guadalcanal, and the Southern Solomons, would go to the Navy. Phase 2, driving up the Solomons and taking Rabaul, would be MacArthur's show. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and created confused command relationships that would haunt the Guadalcanal campaign. The man who didn't want the job. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley was serving as a naval observer in London when he received orders to take command of the South Pacific Force. He arrived in Auckland, New Zealand on June 19, less than 7 weeks before the planned invasion. Gormley was pessimistic from the start. The operation was being rushed. There weren't enough ships, planes, or supplies. Training was inadequate. The troops had never conducted an amphibious landing. Intelligence about Guadalcanal was sketchy at best. He flew to Melbourne to consult with MacArthur, who agreed entirely. The operation should be delayed until proper resources were available. Together, they sent a dispatch to Washington recommending postponement. Admiral King's response was terse. No. The invasion would proceed as planned. King knew what Gormley and MacArthur didn't quite grasp. Time favored Japan. Every day that airfield at Guadalcanal moved closer to completion was another day Japan strengthened its grip on the South Pacific. The operation had to go forward, ready or not. The countdown begins. By late July, forces were assembling. 19,000 Marines training in New Zealand, ships gathering from across the Pacific, supplies being loaded onto transports. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner would command the amphibious force. Major General Alexander van der Grift would lead the 1st Marine Division. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher would provide carrier support. On July 28, Fletcher called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time, the tactical commanders met to discuss the invasion. Fletcher opened by announcing he would support the landings for 2 days only. After that, he was taking his carriers out of danger. The room went silent. Admiral Turner, who understood the global picture better than anyone present, finally spoke. "Admiral, the decision has been made to risk all. It's our job to carry out orders." But Fletcher was adamant. 2 days. Then the carriers would withdraw, leaving the Marines on their own. It was, as Van de Grift would later write, an inauspicious beginning. The rehearsal disaster. July 28th to 30th, Koro Island, Fiji. The rehearsal for the invasion was, in Van de Grift's words, a complete bust. Only a third of the troops managed to get ashore. When they did, they didn't know what to do. Boats got lost. Communications failed. Supplies piled up in confusion. Some boats never even found the beach. Van de Grift regarded the exercise as a disaster, but there was no time to repeat it. On July 31st, the Marines reboarded the transports. Ready or not, they were heading for Guadalcanal. The approach. The task force numbered 75 ships. Transports, cargo vessels, destroyers, cruisers and Fletcher's 3 carriers, Saratoga, Enterprise and Wasp, with their escorts. They steamed northwest through the Coral Sea. On August 4th and 5th, they moved under overcast skies. On August 6th, rain squalls masked them almost all day. As dawn rose on August 7th, the sky cleared. The carriers launched their first strikes at 6 a.m. The Japanese were completely surprised. The air assault. At 6:12 a.m., the communications headquarters at Tulagi Seaplane Base sent a frantic message: "Enemy heavy bombardment in progress." The message went to the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, to Admiral Yamamoto, and to Imperial Headquarters. It was simple and succinct. It was also too late. American carrier planes swept over Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tenambogo, small islands north of Guadalcanal where the Japanese had seaplane bases. They caught the Japanese completely flat-footed. 9 float planes, 1 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 seaplanes were destroyed on the water. Several pilots tried to take off and were shot down before getting airborne. Not a single Japanese plane at Gavutu survived. On Guadalcanal itself, fighters strafed the airfield at Lungo Point. They found no aircraft and no PT boats. They strafed About 250 Japanese troops held Tulagi, men of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment under Captain Shigetoshi Miyazaki. These were experienced, dedicated fighters and they weren't running anywhere. At first, the going seemed manageable. The Marines encountered some resistance from outposts, but they were making progress. The terrain, thick jungle, small trees, vines and bougainvillea with its sharp thorns, seemed to be the worst obstacle. Edson planned to move inland to a ridge running the length of the island, then work along the ridge clearing the slopes. But it took 3 hours to chop their way through a mile and a half of rising ground. When they reached the ridgeline and emerged from the jungle, they ran straight into the central Japanese defenses. The face of Japanese resistance. The Japanese had constructed dugouts and rock emplacements on the hillside, with machine guns carefully positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. The defenses were based on keeping the enemy below them, firing down on attackers. But the Marines discovered that by crawling up the cliffs, they could drop dynamite charges and grenades into the dugouts. It was slow, dangerous work. Each position had to be taken individually. In one dugout, Marines killed 17 Japanese with dynamite charges. A Marine spotted a radio inside and went in to retrieve it. 2 Japanese soldiers were still alive. They shot him and another man who came after him before they were killed. Progress was measured in yards. One company suffered 15% casualties that first afternoon. Snipers seemed to be everywhere, tied in trees and building tops behind rocks. A favorite tactic was to let the forward Marines pass, then shoot at them from behind. It almost always meant death for the sniper, but usually not before he caused several casualties. The Marines were learning lessons that would become grimly familiar. Japanese soldiers fought to the death. They didn't retreat unless ordered. They didn't surrender unless wounded to the point of unconsciousness. The night attack. That night, the Marines had another new experience. Knowing they were outnumbered with no chance of survival, the Japanese staged a desperate counterattack. At 10:30 p.m., they broke through between 2 Marine companies and surrounded one of them. Marines fought in their foxholes and in the open, using guns, machine guns, grenades and knives. The Japanese pushed along the ridge toward Colonel Edson's command post, reaching within 50 yards of him. Finally, the Marines threw them back, but not before one company had lost half its non-commissioned officers. The second day. On August 8th, more troops landed on Tulagi until there were 7,500 Marines on that side of Sealark Channel. Edson's raiders and men of the 5th Battalion, 2nd Marines began moving toward the southeastern end of the island. One by one, they attacked machine gun positions on the steep sides of an old cricket ground. From one cave they removed 35 dead Japanese, some already rotting, some killed in the last moments of defense. This taught the Marines a crucial lesson. Japanese tactics were to hold a position until the last, unless ordered to retreat. It was proof of the iron discipline of Japanese forces. The suicide in the dugout. In one dugout, Marines cornered 3 Japanese officers who had only one loaded pistol among them. As the Marines prepared to assault, they heard 3 shots. When they entered, they found 3 bodies and an empty pistol. One officer had used his last 3 rounds to shoot his companions and then himself. It was hard for Americans to understand. Cornered men with no hope of survival, knowing the enemy had material and numerical advantage, choosing death over surrender. It took getting used to. But after several Japanese had pretended to surrender, then pulled out weapons or exploded grenades to kill themselves and their captors, the Marines learned. Thereafter, there were virtually no further attempts to persuade Japanese soldiers to surrender. Gavutu and Tenembogo, the bloodiest fighting. The fighting on these small connected islands was, if possible, even more vicious than on Tulagi. The Japanese had fortified them well, and the Marines ran into trouble immediately. The second wave of Marines came under intense fire. The third wave was hit before landing craft reached shore. Casualties were heavy. Both islands were dominated by small hills, not quite 150 feet high, but enough. Japanese defenses were built along the slopes, well supplied with machine guns, automatic rifles, and ammunition. Japanese soldiers jammed crowbars under tank treads, threw grenades, tried to set tanks on fire with gasoline-soaked rags. One tank commander had opened his hatch to employ the machine gun, killing 23 Japanese before one scrambled up the side and stabbed him to death with a bayonet. Another Japanese threw gasoline-soaked rags inside and the tank burned. By mid-afternoon, reinforcements were needed. A unit from Florida Island, where there were no Japanese, was called over. At dusk, they received 5 minutes of preparatory bombardment from naval vessels. Unluckily, one of the last shells hit a fuel dump near the beach, lighting up the shore as if it were new. As the Marines approached in their landing craft, Japanese machine guns and rifles poured fire from the hillside dugouts. The Americans were silhouetted perfectly against the sea. 2 boatloads reached the beach. The coxswain of the 3rd boat was killed, and had slewed around heading back to sea. Following boats did the same, thinking orders had changed. The men from 2 boats were stranded ashore. Their only protection was a concrete pier. As soon as they returned fire, the Japanese spotted their positions by the tracers. Captain Crane, the unit leader, was cut off with 5 men. They hid in the brush. In darkness, they escaped to return to the beach after the Japanese withdrew to hillside positions. It was 4 a.m. on August 8 before another unit landed and secured the causeway connecting the islands. When fighting started, there were 500 Japanese on Gavutu and Tanembogo. When fighting ended, there were none. The sergeant and the cave. One story captures the stubbornness of the fighting. Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss approached a cave near the cricket field. He threw a grenade in. On a count of 6, it was lobbed back out. He had to duck his own blast. Another grenade, same result. He held the 3rd grenade for 3 seconds before throwing. On 4, 5, 6, out it came again. He called for a satchel charge, a bag filled with dynamite. He thrust it in and ran. The Japanese thrust it back out. It exploded, driving a rock splinter into his leg. Infuriated, Goss picked up his submachine gun, dashed into the cave spraying fire and killed 4 Japanese soldiers. He counted 8 others who had died earlier. That was Guadalcanal. That was what the Marines were up against. Rabaul reacts. Early on the morning of August 7th, the Tulagi radio station flashed the first word of the invasion to Rabaul. The astounding news reached the airfield just as pilots were preparing for another day's harassment of Australian forces in New Guinea. Orders were immediately cancelled. All available planes were dispatched to strike the American invasion force. Then came worse news. The entire Tulagi flying boat flotilla had been destroyed. Contact with Tulagi was broken. The base had been overrun. At 8:30 a.m., a flight of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers took off from Rabaul. They had been loaded for strikes against Australians, so they carried bombs instead of torpedoes. 18 Zero fighters accompanied them. They climbed to 13,000 feet, flew east to Bougainville, then turned south. The Coast Watcher warning. At 9 a.m., Paul Mason, a coast watcher on Malabai Hill on Bougainville, sent a message, 24 bombers heading toward Guadalcanal. They were still 400 miles, 2.5 hours away, when that message was broadcast from Pearl Harbor to the fleet. The invasion fleet had plenty of time to prepare. On HMS Canberra, an Australian cruiser, the bosun's mate piped, "The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 11 o'clock." The torpedo bombers came right on schedule. The first air battle. American fighter planes climbed above the bombers to 20,000 feet. As the Japanese reached the north shore of Guadalcanal at noon, the Wildcats were ready. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese felt the results of a coordinated defense. Of 24 Bettys that arrived over Guadalcanal, all but 1 were shot down. The only damage was to the destroyer Mugford, hit by a single bomb. But against the Zero fighters it was a different story. Of 41 Devastator torpedo bombers that attacked earlier, only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo hit. Saburo Sakai's mission. Among the 18 Zero pilots was Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading ace. He was puzzled by American tactics. The Navy pilots dove against the Zeros, but if they missed on the first pass they scattered and evaded. They had been well instructed. The Zero was superior in turning and climbing ability. In a dogfight the Zero would win. So American pilots were taught, dive fast, shoot and get out. Don't dogfight. After a grim battle, Sakai shot down 1 F-4F and an SBD dive bomber. But he then attacked what he thought was a group of torpedo bombers, actually rear gunners and SBD dive bombers. He flew straight into fire from 4 machine guns. His Zero was badly smashed. He was seriously wounded, blood filling his cockpit. Yet he managed to fly the plane back to Rabaul, over 500 miles, and land it before collapsing. It was a testament to both his skill and the Zero's range. But it also showed that American pilots were learning. They were finding ways to use the Zero's weaknesses, limited firepower and inability to absorb damage, against it. The balance of air power. By nightfall of the first day, the situation was clear. Control of the air would be hotly contested. The Americans had the advantage of proximity, carriers close offshore. But the Japanese had numbers at Rabaul and the superiority of the Zero over the Wildcat. The carrier pilots quickly developed tactics. Stick close together, use the scissors movement. Two planes constantly turning toward each other, concentrating superior firepower while absorbing punishment that would destroy a Zero. But Fletcher's concern was growing. He had lost 21 of 99 carrier planes in 2 days, not a high loss rate by operational standards, but enough to convince him that his decision to withdraw was sound. The unfolding disaster. What neither Fletcher, Turner, nor Van de Grift knew was that a Japanese surface force was already approaching. Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa, commanding the 8th Fleet from Rabaul, had reacted immediately to news of the invasion. He couldn't send troop transports. The submarine S-38 had sunk one transport with 342 men, convincing him it was too dangerous. But he could send warships. On the afternoon of August 7th, 5 heavy cruisers left Caveying on New Ireland. They were joined by the heavy cruiser Chokai with Mikawa aboard, 2 light cruisers and a destroyer. Mikawa's plan was simple: cut speed to arrive after midnight on August 8th, then make a surprise night attack on the American forces at the beachhead. Night attacks were a Japanese specialty. The Americans had no record of competence in night naval operations. If Mikawa could surprise them, the effectiveness would be enormous. The intelligence failure. For intelligence about Japanese ship movements, the Americans at Guadalcanal depended on air search and submarine reports. Early on August 7th, the cruisers were sighted by US B-17 bombers as they moved toward Rabaul. That evening, they were sighted by submarine S-38 as they came out of St. George's Channel. But these reports weren't given much credence. Rabaul was a forward base. Ships moving in and out were normal. No one saw any indication the ships were steaming toward Guadalcanal. The problem was coordination. Admiral Gormley was responsible for overall operations, but he had to depend on multiple sources for air searches. General MacArthur's B-17s, operating independently. Admiral McCain's land-based Navy patrol bombers. Admiral Fletcher's carrier planes, which made no searches at all. Fletcher was too worried about his carriers. On operation, Midway resulted in the loss of 4 fleet carriers and Japan's offensive capability. The loss at Midway didn't stop Japanese plans in the south. The continued southern advance threatened Australia. The threat to Australia forced America to act before it was ready. That action was Guadalcanal. Each link in the chain was forged by human decisions made under pressure with incomplete information. Yamamoto's decision to pursue Midway was rational given his strategic assumptions. But those assumptions were wrong. Fletcher's decision to withdraw the carriers would contribute to one of the U.S. Navy's worst defeats, the Battle of Savo Island, which would unfold the night after our story ends. The learning curve. What's remarkable about the American performance at Guadalcanal isn't that it was perfect. It wasn't. The rehearsal was a disaster. Intelligence was faulty. Command relationships were confused. Fletcher abandoned the landing force. The air search missed an approaching enemy fleet. What's remarkable is that the Americans learned from every mistake. They developed new tactics against the Zero. They improved amphibious operations. They fixed command structures. They enhanced intelligence networks. The Japanese, conversely, didn't learn. They continued to underestimate American resolve. They fragmented their forces. They relied on night attacks and superior fighting spirit to overcome material disadvantage. Most critically, they refused to acknowledge the extent of the Midway defeat, allowing strategic planning to proceed on false premises. The human element. Wars are fought by machines, but they're decided by men. Jimmy Doolittle, volunteering for a mission that made no tactical sense but enormous psychological impact. The 80 raiders who followed him knowing many wouldn't return. The Marines stepping onto a hostile beach for the first time in a generation. The coast watchers who stayed behind enemy lines to radio warnings. The pilots who flew into overwhelming fire. And on the other side, the Japanese construction workers who fled into the jungle. The defenders of Tulagi who fought to the last man. Saburo Sakai flying 500 miles with grievous wounds. The 3 officers who chose death over surrender. The outcome of the Pacific War wasn't inevitable on August 7, 1942. Japan still held the initiative across most of the theater. The Americans were fighting on a shoestring with green troops and second-line equipment. But the Americans had something Japan didn't, the capacity to scale. Behind the Marines on Guadalcanal was the industrial might of a continent. The carriers Fletcher so carefully husbanded would be replaced by dozens more. The planes lost in combat would be replaced by thousands more. The lessons learned would be applied to dozens of future operations. The turning point. Historians often debate when the tide turned in the Pacific. Some say Midway. Others say Guadalcanal. The truth is it was both, and neither. The war turned when Japan failed to win quickly. Yamamoto understood this. He had 18 months to force a negotiated peace. He used that time to pursue a decisive battle that backfired. And when that battle failed, Japan had no plan B. The Doolittle raid forced Japan to fight the war Yamamoto feared, a long war of attrition against an enemy with greater resources. Guadalcanal was where that war of attrition began in earnest. The night ahead. As darkness fell on August 8, 1942, the Marines on Guadalcanal and Tulagi were exhausted but victorious. They had secured their objectives. The airfield was in American hands. The Japanese had been driven back or killed. Admiral Turner's transports were preparing to withdraw at dawn, taking with them most of the supplies the Marines would need. Fletcher's carriers were already steaming away to the southeast. And through the darkness, Admiral Mikawa's cruiser force was approaching through the slot, completely undetected. In a few hours, the Battle of Savo Island would begin, one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. But that's another story. What matters is this. Despite the mistakes, despite the losses, despite the setbacks, the Americans had established a foothold. They had shown they could strike back. They had proven that Japan's defensive perimeter could be penetrated. The road from Guadalcanal to Tokyo would take 3 more years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But on August 7, 1942, that road began. And it began because 80 men in 16 bombers had flown into the dawn over Tokyo 4 months earlier, proving that nothing, not even the sacred homeland, was beyond America's reach. Jimmy Doolittle, expecting a court-martial for losing all 16 of his bombers, instead received the Medal of Honor and was promoted 2 ranks to brigadier general. He would go on to command the 8th Air Force in Europe. Of the 80 Doolittle raiders, 69 eventually returned home. They became heroes, symbols of American daring and innovation. They held reunions for over 70 years, each year toasting their fallen comrades with cognac from bottles they'd saved since 1942. The last public reunion was in 2013, when only 4 raiders survived. The last raider, Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, died in 2019 at the age of 103. The Marines who landed on Guadalcanal would fight for 6 more months before the island was secured. Of the 60,000 Americans who eventually served on Guadalcanal, 7,100 would die. Japanese losses exceeded 30,000. But the island, and the airfield the Marines would name Henderson Field, remained in American hands. It became the launching point for the drive up the Solomon's chain toward Rabaul, and ultimately toward Japan itself. Admiral Yamamoto had been right about one thing. Japan had run wild for 6 months. But after Midway and Guadalcanal, that wild run was over. The Empire of Japan would never again go on the offensive in the Pacific. And it all began with 16 bombers over Tokyo on a spring morning in 1942.